I'm Lainey Signer, and I am the director of Terra.do's Climate Farm School program. And I am delighted to be hosting this panel event today on regenerative ocean farming. And I'm originally from the East Coast, but I'm speaking to you all today from my tiny house here in Sebastopol, California. And I've spent most of my academic and professional career thinking about land-based regenerative agriculture. And when I started reading more about farming seaweed and shellfish as part of what we're now calling regenerative ocean farming, I was blown away by the enormous potential of this multifaceted climate and environmental solution. Seaweed has a tremendous role to play in regenerating marine ecosystems, absorbing carbon emissions, and serving as a sustainable source of protein. When coupled with shellfish farming of oysters and mussels, the marine ecosystem benefits multiply along with the food provision in the small area. It just makes so much sense. I kept thinking, why aren't we doing this everywhere already? And while I honestly can't wait to get my own string of kelp and mussels set up with my dad at our family home in Rhode Island, I know I have a lot more to learn first from experts like those represented on our panel today. So it's truly an honor to be hosting these panelists. We have Scott Lindell from the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution. We have Tamsin Peoples from the University of Alaska Fairbanks. We have Samantha Garwin from Green Wave and Courtney Myers from Akua. And it really is a unique opportunity today to hear from four corners of the kelp and seaweed farming industry, as the next slide will show. We have the research side, the entrepreneurship and product development side. We have what I'm calling the industry enablement side and the farming side. So here's where we're going to go in the next 50 minutes or so. We'll hear from each of the panelists in 5 to 7 minute lightning talks. And then we'll jump into some Q&A with a few questions my colleague Amy and I have prepared, and then other questions from all of you, which you can put in through the chat and Amy will help me moderate. And then we'll do a quick 4 to 5 minute breakout room towards the end, time permitting, where you'll share an action you hope to take as a result of the information shared here today. Because we are Terra.do, we are all about all of our events having an action orientation. And then we will all come back together for a few next steps and calls to action that Amy will share. And a quick note of housekeeping, if you would like to just see the speakers, they will be pinned. So you can click on the speaker view at the top right of your Zoom screen and you can see just those speakers and not all of our wonderful participants. So, okay, with that, I'll turn it over to you, Scott, to kick off our lightning talks and further introduce yourself and your work.
Thanks. I'm going to share my screen first. Here we go. I'm going to play this video in the background so you don't have to look at me, just the talking head. This is just a brief introduction. This video sort of depicts part of the cycle of my research where we're harvesting and figuring out what different strains of kelp we're growing out in the field. So I'm going to turn the sound off. There we go. So I've been growing food and water for about 36 years, first as an entrepreneur, then as a research specialist in Woods Hole here for the last 20 years or so. My introduction to seaweed farming came at a conference where I learned about seaweed's practical use, along with shellfish farming, for extracting excessive nutrients from the waters and helping to clean up our coastal waters. That's where I met my mentor to this day, UConn professor Charlie Yarish, who technically launched commercial kelp farming in the US only about 12 years ago. Today, my research is focused largely on how we can intelligently farm the oceans, and particularly a seaweed known as sugar kelp. And we want to avoid many of the unsustainable practices that have become, unfortunately, part of our land-based agricultural systems. Let me set the stage for why seaweed farming is so important and how it addresses a wide range of local and global problems. As Lainey pointed out, when these farms are properly placed and managed, these ocean farms can be restorative to ocean environments. They can help counter climate change and relieve pressure to farm sensitive terrestrial environments, places that deserve conservation and stay conserved. Seaweeds are important for our personal needs. They produce healthy proteins and complex carbohydrates and micronutrients important to humans and to livestock health. They're part of many personal care products like your toothpaste and cosmetics. Seaweeds can be the raw materials for making carbon neutral biofuels and bioplastics. And seaweed farming is meeting a lot of social needs by providing sustainable jobs, revitalizing working waterfronts, and improving the US balance of trade. And finally, seaweed farming provides ecosystems benefits such as carbon sequestration, nutrient removal, and fish and seaweed nursery habitats, while having perhaps the lowest carbon footprint of any food production system. Now, let me set the context for ocean farming as I try to walk and chew gum here at the same time. I'm going to close out this video. We all know that this impending crisis we have in terms of population growth and the need to feed an additional 2 billion mouths by mid-century. To add to that challenge, we're going to need to feed ourselves with the looming and uncertain impact of climate change on that food production. So this gives pause to how are we going to do that? Because we're certainly not going to do it with more fishing from the ocean. Aquaculture is filling that gap in meat and seafood, and we're not going to bridge it by more terrestrial farming because we simply don't have the arable land available unless we're going to undo all the conservation we've tried to do with rainforests and the like. So we're going to need to think beyond the land. And I've got a little graphic here I want to show. Go back to QuickTime. I'll do this in full screen mode. So in order to meet that gap in feeding the world population by mid-century, we would need to basically discover and develop agricultural land equivalent to an additional continental United States. But if we applied marine farming, like shellfish and seaweeds, to better take advantage of the ocean's bounty in an area equivalent to New York State and New England, spread out all around the globe, we could harvest all the additional protein and calories we need by 2050. So if we look at this next figure, which is right here, put this in full screen mode, you'll see that
we aren't seeing anything, Scott.
You're not seeing anything. Okay. I'll share here. All right. I'm going to wing it in the interest of time. Imagine this figure that shows basically shows cows, chickens, and pork, pigs relative to salmon, seaweeds, and shellfish. The marine proteins, like the seaweeds, the shellfish, and the salmon, all dwarf the land protein varieties in terms of their scarcity of needs for resources like water and feed and land use. In fact, what's amazing is that kelp and seaweeds are actually carbon negative. They soak up more carbon than they actually emit in their farming. So this is exactly the kind of food production we're going to need in this next century to meet our population needs as well as our ecosystem preservation. So I'm really excited about seaweed farming's potential. I've been so lucky to try and tackle some of these global problems and work with a dedicated community of scientific and commercial collaborators and agencies like the World Wildlife Fund, the Nature Conservancy, NOAA, and the Department of Energy. I'm thrilled to be here with the rest of our guests on this panel to share our accumulated wisdom about how we can truly harness seaweeds and their full potential.
Your use case, you're on this global data.
Thank you so much, Scott. That was wonderful. And no worries, we can send any slides and everything in follow up so we can check out those amazing figures you were referencing.
Okay.
And Tamsin, I'll turn it over to you to continue with our lightning talks.
Great. Well, thank you so much. My name is Tamsin. I'm seeing a lot of actually familiar names in the group that's come online here to see. So that's really awesome. Let me share my screen and we'll get started on my presentation. So I have designed, built, and operated Alaska's first 3 commercial kelp hatcheries in the state of Alaska, which has been wonderful privilege. I kind of fell into mariculture. I started working with the group that became Blue Evolution back in 2015. And to give you an idea of how this hatchery works is we're really tied into the natural life cycle of the seaweed. So here's a made up kelp plant. We've got the big blades and the leafy bits, and they have some reproductive material that at certain times in the year release these spores. And these spores swim around in the water for a day or so before they stop, settle down, and stick to something. And they can stick to any sort of surface, the bottom of your boat, a PVC pipe, or what we're hoping is some string. They germinate into little gametophytes. We have males and females, and then they fertilize each other into tiny little kelp babies. And then those kelp babies grow into the giant, big, beautiful plants that we want to harvest that we saw in Scott's presentation. So what do we need to make a kelp hatchery? Well, we need those kelp spores, number one. Then we need sterile seawater that's from a good, clean, nutrient-rich source. We need temperature control. So there's an ideal temperature range that kelp can grow really, really well at. It's about 10 to 12 degrees Celsius for these big brown seaweeds like the sugar kelp Scott was talking about. They like a certain amount of light, and they really like the 12 hours of dark, 12 hours of light. And they need some aeration to help with their gas exchange and to help just mix the water around. So it seems like a pretty simple formula to make a kelp hatchery. And it doesn't take a whole lot. Here's those little guys swimming around. That's what the spores look like as they're microscopic. So this is the first installation that I had at the University of Alaska Southeast in Juneau. I started working with Dr. Steckel doing a feasibility study in 2015. And he had these incubators, which are basically glorified refrigerators with light control and temperature control. And we had these little 2.5 liter aquariums that we were growing little seeded pipes in. So PVC pipe wrapped with string that we had our little kelp babies growing on. That year we grew about 1,000 feet or so for some R&D outplanting sites across the state of Alaska, Sitka, Kachemak Bay, and Juneau. But we needed to upgrade to a commercial scale, and it had to go pretty quickly. So this is the first commercial operation. It was built out of a cold room that was being unused at the University of Alaska Southeast Anderson building, which I just basically thought, if you have a small incubator, why don't you make a big incubator, one that you can just walk in and out of? So we went from 1,000 feet to 16,000 feet, which is a pretty big upgrade in scaling. You can see these tall PVC pipes wrapped with string, and all those little brown dots are baby kelps growing. I'll see if this video works. It wasn't the most elegant process for changing tanks. This is a time lapse of me trying to change the tanks. I had to pump the water out of the tanks, out of the room, into the holding tank for treatment before I could dump it. But this just gives you a better visualization of what the hatchery looked like. It's a little jumpy right now because of the internet, but each week I had to change those tanks out, drain the water, add new fertilizer for them. And everything that you see in this room came from either the local hardware stores, Amazon, or just the boneyard of pipe scraps behind the university. So it was a pretty slapdash ad hoc hatchery operation, but it worked. We had great success with the production. But there was always bigger and better to be done. So the following year, I was able to do a whole custom order. I could get exactly what I wanted, how I wanted it. I did custom tanks and racks. And we moved our operation from Juneau up to the Kodiak Fisheries Research Center. That year, we went from 16,000 feet to over 76,000 feet of production, with room to do another 76 to 85,000 feet of production. This was a much more refined system. I could actually have good drainage. I didn't have to pump the tanks out. And it was a beautiful space working with the NOAA lab there. But just like any operation, there's going to be challenges. And there is a continuous number of challenges that I was facing year after year with running these hatcheries. Primarily contamination. You can see these pipes are looking a little green. Kelp's not green. That's something else growing in there that's contaminating my tanks. Because we're working with wild parent stocks of parent plants every single year, that's a good vector or way for contamination to come in. Could also be coming in on your seawater if it's not sterilized or treated properly. I've also seen a lot of uneven growth. You can see in this picture on the right-hand side of the slide, there's some big baby kelp blades. You can actually see them with your naked eye. And then other parts of these pipes look kind of naked. And within a single tank, everything should be ideally considered the same treatment, the same exposure to light, nutrients, spores, but I'd always get uneven growth. Again, sterilizing that seawater has always been a big challenge, especially as you start ramping up production. More and more seawater is coming in, more and more fertilizers being used. How do you keep that sterile and from bringing in more and more contamination? And then timing, we're still based on the wild natural life cycle of kelps. So if you want to be outplanting at a certain time, but the kelp isn't ready for sporulation or releasing those spores, you're kind of stuck waiting on the kelp. So coordinating between the farmers and the processors and the hatchery operation is a big hurdle to get through. And unfortunately, a lot of these hatcheries produce a lot of plastic waste. All of the seed string that you see wrapped around these pipes, that's 76,000 feet of material. That's all a synthetic polyester string that's going to go into the landfill at the end of every single season. Another big hurdle that we're overcoming is organic certification. Because the fertilizers we're using are considered commercial and they're not organic, we can't certify the kelp production as being organic. And then the seasonality is that hatcheries are only in use about 2 months out of the year. So that's a lot of space and a lot of resource allocation for only a short period of the calendar year. So what do you do with it the rest of the time? Which brings us to what the future of commercial installations might look like. I see a large potential in having a refrigerated container unit, like these vertical growth containers that are doing hydroponics that are already in operation around the world, including within Alaska. This could be run as a co-op by independent farmers. There's, temperature control, light control, and then on the off season, they could run as greenhouses, or you could just package them up and store them to the side. You could also pair with a processor or research facility for seawater access, because that's going to be the one limiting factor. You could put these things anywhere as long as you have access to good seawater. So thank you. That's basically been my journey working with these commercial kelp operations, and I look forward to getting to chat with everybody and answering any questions further on as we go.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Tamsin. And with that, we will turn it over to Sam for your intro and lightning talk.
Okay, awesome. I do not have slides, so we're just going to talk. So I'm Sam Garin. I've been working as Greenwave's market innovation strategist for the last 2.5 years or so, and I have a background in building markets for emerging regenerative food systems more broadly. So as I'm sure many of you know, from checking out our website or reading the materials that were sent out ahead of time, Greenwave's mission is to grow a global network of regenerative ocean farmers. And we have a goal of scaling ocean farming by training and supporting 10,000 farmers in the next 10 years. But one thing I want to talk about and then kind of put out here through the group is that not all scale is created equal. And so how we scale is a really important question. And oftentimes when we talk about scale, there are a lot of assumptions built in that are actually based on industrial metaphors. And so we tend to think of things that are bigger. We tend to think of monocultures. We tend to think of consolidation, and that's both in terms of operational consolidation or product consolidation, but also a consolidation of wealth. That's what people want when they invest in something, is the opportunity to make a lot of money. But when you think about all of those things implied with that model of scale, nothing about that is regenerative. The simplest way that I think about regenerative systems is looking to nature for blueprints of growth and resiliency. And nothing in nature is a monoculture. Nothing in nature scales the way that I just described. There's no mega anthill anywhere. There's no city of birds. There are lots of examples, though, of systems that replicate, from the smallest examples being individual cells, bacteria and viruses, all the way up to complex ecosystems. So Greenwave's approach is unique in that we are not looking to consolidate or vertically integrate or make any kind of like monolithic kelp farm, kelp industry. What our approach is to replicate a model, a smaller scale model that works across diverse people, diverse geographies, and works with rather than against existing ecosystems, communities, and infrastructure. And that's why our goal is 10,000 farmers in the next 10 years, not like 100 mega farmers. So on a practical level, that means that supporting farmers involves not just working with farmers, but also working with people and companies across the supply chain and at all different sizes, because you can't go from startup to even medium scale company overnight. You really have to have someone to sell to when you're a very small startup farm. You need to have someone to sell to when you're a small farmer, and then someone who can grow with you as you become a medium or even large scale farmer perhaps. And so we need to make sure that everybody has the connections, the knowledge, the resources that they need to do that work themselves. And we need independent businesses that are each able to hold a piece of the supply chain and do it really well so that the whole value chain works well together. So when I think about, or how I talk about market innovation, is as this connective tissue between stakeholders, such as researchers like Scott, to farmers, to hatchery operators, to processors, value-added product companies like Akua, and investors. And so, GreenWave has historically been very focused on helping people get into ocean farming, and that will continue to be a big part of what we do. But it's equally important to help them then figure out what they're going to do with all that kelp when it comes out of the water. So if they don't have a processing facility to stabilize it, or a way to get it there, or a customer to sell it to once it's stabilized, they're not going to stay farmers very long, and we're not going to hit that goal of having 10,000 successful small businesses that are also kelp farms. And so this is the piece that I think Lainey was referring to as industry enablement, and at GreenWave, we call market innovation.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Sam. That was a really, really helpful overview. And I love the vision of 10,000 kelp farmers in the next 10 years and making that work in different contexts and geographies. That really resonates with visions for regenerative land-based farming that I think are similar. So with that, I will turn it over to our last panelist to do an intro and lightning talk. Over to you, Courtney.
Thank you so much for having me. And it's so good to see so many familiar faces on this call, like Scott and Sam, and great to meet everyone else. Sharing my screen and lightning talk, ready to rock. Okay, so hi, I'm Courtney Boyd-Myers. This is Akua. This is our team. This is myself on the left in the otter costume, and we are in this photo. We basically were selling kelp burgers to all the Yale football games this fall. My co-founder is in the middle, and my mom is on his right, and our first employee is on his left, and that's startup life. I'm Courtney Boyd-Myers. I'm the founder and CEO of Akua. And I started this company almost, 2017. So, 4 or 5 years ago. And I was very inspired by GreenWave's work. One of my friends used to work with GreenWave, one of my friends I grew up with, a guy named Brendan Coffey, who's now our independent board director. And he took me out on the GreenWave farm in New Haven. I ate a piece of kelp, just like in this photo, and I was totally hooked. I think we've really heard so much of the environmental and economic benefits of growing kelp on this call. So I'm going to focus on, our products and the health benefits. But obviously the environmental benefits and the economic benefits are a huge part of why we do what we do. Our mission is to be a global leader, pioneering a new sustainable food category that's just as healthy for you as it is for the planet too, starting with ocean farmed sea greens. My background's in technology and startups. I worked for some, pretty cool, fast growth consumer tech. I was turning the corner on 30 a few years back, and I was, always aware of healthy eating. My dad, who's amazing, he built marketing campaigns like the Burger King Kids Club and Chester the Cheeto and the Keebler Elves, and kind of was marketing a lot of the companies that were on the wrong side of history, if you will. And I think a diet over the past couple decades that has led to, alarming obesity rates. My own father has had cancer twice, heart disease twice, and given himself diabetes as a result of eating the kind of diet he was marketing. So from a really early age, I was obsessed with getting people to eat healthier. I went plant-based at 16 and haven't really looked back since. Really excited about how much innovation is happening in that vegan food space. And so in parallel to this, obviously was realizing all of the environmental destruction that was going on in our food systems, with factory farming and monocropping and just poisoning our water supply, et cetera. So I thought, wow, there has to be a way to create a food company that addresses both personal health and addresses environmental health. And so when I took that tour of the kelp farm at Greenwave, and it was April 2016 now, I had ate that piece of kelp off the rope. I thought, this is it. Sideline, I had always been kind of that weird white girl walking around Asian stores trying to make my own seaweed salads. I loved seaweed, and I didn't understand why 1/3 or more of the world eats seaweed on a daily basis for all of its health benefits. And yet, like, we've completely lost that part of our food culture in the more like Caucasian, white European American world. So I set out to change that. And I thought, what's more American than making kelp burgers? That's our main product today. We source 100% of our kelp to make those kelp burgers from New England-based ocean farmers. We work really closely with Greenwave to create our farmer network. And like everyone has said, all of this kelp, it's so amazing. It grows without dry land or fresh water, and has incredible effects by sequestering carbon and nitrogen from the sea by growing through photosynthesis. So this is Colleen. She's our kelp farmer up in Maine. We had a blast going to visit her up in May last year. If you ever get the opportunity to visit a kelp farm, it is just so special. I highly recommend it. It's, for me, like this very romantic experience. I think we all are aware of what it's like to, go fishing and be on the water and be ocean hunters, but to be around people who are ocean gardeners and farming something that doesn't want to escape, but just wants to sit there and grow. It's really beautiful. And for any women born in the 1980s who wanted to be the Little Mermaid growing up, I think there's definitely something to it. So kelp for your health. This is a big part of what we do at Akua. Basically, from a macronutrient perspective, kelp is sort of, not that interesting. I mean, it's really low in calories. It's got teeny bits of protein. It's got, bits of fiber. But from a micronutrient perspective, you are looking at a powerhouse of vitamins and minerals, particularly CBK, iron, fiber, and it's got incredible detoxifying effects. And it's also really high in iodine, which is amazing for people who have hypothyroidism. It's amazing for pregnant women like myself who are building new cell blocks inside of them and bringing new humans into the world. So I've been eating a lot of kelp. I've got like low iron levels, so eating kelp to combat that, and just really recommend adding this to anyone's diet, who's trying to eat healthier. Kelp is fine. We're finally here, Sam. We've been working on this for years, and then finally 2022 is the year the New York Times put kelp on its front page. What will Americans eat this year? Really exciting stuff. I think, we've been banging this drum for a long time, and we're finally kind of turning a corner. Well and Good also in the same week said step aside kale. Finally, it's all about eating sea greens. So we're really excited about this. So here's our kelp burger. It is the world's first kelp burger that's made from ocean farmed kelp. There's other burgers out there that incorporate seaweed, but they kind of just throw it in as like a last minute ingredient. This burger, kelp is the #1 ingredient, as you can see on our panel, which means if you guys know nutrition panels, they're ordered by weight. So we're really proud of how much kelp is in this burger, but of course our challenge is always how much kelp can you feed people with them still tasting delicious and everybody still really liking it, because not everyone grew up eating kelp, and it's a new sensory that you're getting in your mouth. So that's always been a fun challenge for us. this product is available, on 40 plus grocery stores right now in New York City and LA. We launched direct to consumer last year, so we've been sold nationwide for about 9 months. I'll send you guys discount codes and websites and all sorts of things right after this chat. I'll throw them in the chat. This is, I like to think that if Kelp is the culinary equivalent of the electric car, then this is the Tesla of burgers. It is the only vegan burger out there that's leveraging the really craveable umami taste of kelp and mushrooms. So a lot of people ask me, well, does it taste like beef? And we're actually not trying to replicate a beef burger. There's a lot of great companies that do that. They have to use like highly processed ingredients and a lot of chemicals in order to kind of fake a burger. We're trying to produce something that's, you're not going to miss the meat when you eat this, but it's definitely a plant-based burger. When we pitch investors, we always say we're at the intersection of two massive trends: huge growing sea greens market and a huge growing plant-based food market. I think that makes Akua really unique and a big opportunity. We've gotten rave reviews on this burger. I'm sure a lot of people on this call have tried it. If you haven't, I highly recommend it. I'm really, really proud of the kelp burger, and I eat it or a ground meat product almost every day. This is where we really shine. We're really trying to produce a kelp burger like that is not full of things like methicellulose and cultured dextrose and all these other ingredients that are, sort of all over the plant-based food scene that make these products maybe even less healthier than their like grass-fed beef components. So, again, our mission is not just about creating plant-based products, it's about healthy products, environmentally healthy products. Like I said, our macronutrients from kelp are pretty good, but our micronutrients is really where we stand out. I mean, have you seen a burger that also looks like your multivitamin? I don't think so. This is so impressive. I'm so proud of this. And that's Taro the otter. If you haven't seen our otter yet, he's our mascot. We love Taro the otter. We also have a kelp ground meat, which my husband and I have been eating pasta almost every night because I am pregnant. So why not? And we put this in with like a bolognese, and it's like the most delicious thing ever. So if you've tried the kelp burger and you haven't tried our ground meat yet, I highly recommend this form factor. We're going to be making it a little smaller and launching this in retail too, probably at the end of Q1. But this is a really versatile product. You can make tacos with it, bolognese, anything that you would do with ground beef, really. So my last slide, what's next for Akua that I want you guys to all get really excited about? We're launching a vegan kelp crab cake this summer. And we're actually launching the beta in 2 weeks, and we're looking for beta testers. So I'm going to drop the link to sign up for that as well. Would love to have you part of this. We're really excited to be entering not just the plant-based food space, but also the plant-based seafood space this summer with this product. And that's it for me. So I hope I stayed under the 7 minutes. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Courtney. That was fabulous and really delightful to learn about all the things that are happening at Akua and the health aspects of growing kelp and using it for products. So there were a few questions that came in about that in the chat. So we'll get to those in a minute, but I'm going to kick off the Q&A portion right now by just asking a few questions to all 4 of our panelists that my colleague Amy and I brainstormed a little bit in advance, and then we'll open it up to all of the wonderful questions from the audience. Okay, so my first question, and we'll just stick with the order that folks presented in for now for these first 4, and then I'll direct them to specific people if the audience questions are more directed. So the first question is to just visualize a future in which the potential of regenerative seaweed farming is fully realized. So Sam already spoke to this a little bit, but we're going to go more in depth. What does this future look like to you, Scott?
Well, right now, it probably wasn't clear to those who aren't clear, who don't understand kelp farming, that it's only a 5 or 6 month process, pretty much. It's a winter time crop, and I see that there's a lot of future opportunity for summertime seaweed crops too. I've done a little bit with Gracilaria, some of the reds like Eucheuma in the tropics, and dulse may also grow at higher latitudes for the summer. So looking at a full cycle growing season, different species, and I think we want to see more intercropping of different species. So just like land farmers, we don't want to grow a monocrop. We want to be able to intercrop so that diseases or potential predators are less likely to choose one species or another. And then intercropping with shellfish, as has been mentioned. They're the perfect companions to grow together in terms of their nutritional needs, and one's waste is another's food. I think that's going to be really important. And there's still this whole part of the farming cycle, both on land and in water, that we really don't understand very well. And I think there are ways we can foster better microbiomes and fungal associations with our marine farms, just as we are beginning to learn about them on land. These are important parts of understanding and nurturing an ecosystem. So really, there's no waste. Our bioeconomies in the ocean will be circular. That's my future vision.
That's, yeah, definitely. Yeah, and I definitely think the research keeping up with what's happening in this new and emerging industry is super important. So more studying and bettering our understanding of things like oceans, just like I think about bettering our understanding of soils, is super important. These things that we can't always see. Okay, over to you, Tamsin, for your vision.
Yeah, Julie Decker with the Alaska Fisheries Development Foundation always has been saying a farm for every fisherman. So a lot of the fishermen here in Alaska work with the summer-based salmon fisheries, but don't really have a lot, or there's been collapse in some of the winter fisheries. So if we can have those same farmers who are experienced on the water, have the boats, have the infrastructure, be able to grow seaweed, it could be a huge winter economy in areas where there is no winter economy. I see private and community farms. I love the idea of having these independent farmers running alongside these community co-op style farms. I see federal and state level seaweed specific permits and regulations, which we don't have yet, but if we can get that momentum going, there's a lot of interest and support, but there is still a lot of moving and shaking that needs to be done. I see a way to make it sustainable. So keeping it as a biologically sustainable industry. So you're going to have animals and critters coming in to utilize those kelp farms, but making sure that we don't just leave them high and dry during harvest. So creating these biorefugias around them, making sure we have genetic diversity, and being socioeconomically responsible, making sure that everybody has equal access to this new industry. Something that I've seen a lot of folks, especially with Green Wave, really pioneering. And I just see the future of coastal Alaska just being covered with kelp farms in the winter. And I'm looking forward to it immensely.
Awesome, me too. Sam, over to you.
Sure. Well, Scott and Tamsin have said a lot, but I would say, future regenerative seaweed farming is many diverse, we call them reefs, so like groups of seaweed farmers, whether they're totally independent or working as cooperatives, like some people are already starting to do in the Northeast and Alaska. That'd be amazing. On land, we want to see processing hubs. So, for each maybe reasonably sized geographic area, some kind of on-land infrastructure that can help stabilize seaweed, aggregate both supply and demand to kind of lift that burden off of the farmer a bit, and a regulatory systems that is supportive of both the farming side and the food processing innovation side. And then product companies that, like Akua, really understand their role in the supply chain as making and honoring purchasing commitments so that farmers can plan on growth as opposed to just, planting more kelp without having any idea where it's going to go. And product companies that are committed to paying what will amount to a living wage for that farmer, regardless of whether they're doing it full time or just half the year.
Awesome. Love it. Great additions. Courtney, bring us home with some visions.
Yeah, I mean, I think, we look at this from a product standpoint, right? And I think one of the reasons we started Akua is when I met with Brent Smith from Green Wave, I said, how can I really help kick this off? And he's like, we can keep growing it and growing the farmer network, but we need more people to eat it or do amazing things with it, whether it's, pharmaceuticals, beauty, bioplastics. And I think it was Scott who told me in one of our fantastic meetings, and Scott, I miss you. I want to hang out soon. But you know, kind of has to start with food because that's where you can fetch the higher price per pound before it keeps scaling up and the seaweed can get cheaper and cheaper. So, you know, when people ask me like, who are your competitors in the kelp product space? I'm like, it's a rising tide lifts all boats scenario here. Like we don't even see other food products that are making, you know, kelp based things as competitors. I mean, if someone launched a kelp burger, I'd be really annoyed. But you know, where there's the Atlantic Sea Farms has amazing kelp kimchi and kelp seaweed salads. 12 Tides has kelp chips that are delicious. There's kelp granola out there. I mean, there's these little things that are coming onto the market that are helping us tell that same story and educating consumers. I mean, there's so much work to be done educating consumers. I mean, I don't think anyone on this call is part of that. I think everyone knows kelp and the differences between a wild kelp forest and a kelp farm, but just trying to tell a consumer that we don't source our kelp from wild kelp forests and we're not a part of that destruction is a huge barrier for us. I mean, it's something that, you know, really takes a whole village to introduce this new supply chain and why it's so great. It takes a lot of journalists, you know, it's something that I think we're all working on together. So yeah, I want to see more people using kelp in their products, you know, so that kelp can not just be the new kale, but something even much bigger and versatile.
Awesome. Thank you, Courtney. Okay, so I'm going to combine these next two questions into one, which moving on from the vision, we're going to talk a little bit more about the barriers and challenges to scaling seaweed as a solution. So from your perspectives, what are some of the biggest barriers or challenges to scaling the solution? And with that, we've heard from some aspiring seaweed farmers that regulatory systems can be a time-consuming barrier to overcome, as I think Tamsin and Scott briefly touched on. So if we invite you, if you care to speak to a specific example of a regulatory challenge that you've encountered, and any advice to others in similar situations on how to navigate these. So barriers, biggest barrier, including possibly regulatory. Okay, over to you, Scott. Oh, I think you're still muted.
There.
Oh, sorry. Oh, I just clicked mute. Sorry, that was my bad. I clicked on your screen.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, sorry. Yeah, I'll start with the sort of the elephant in the room around permitting. For those of you who are not familiar with doing anything in the ocean, permitting for activities that involve space in this public space of the oceans is glacially slow. It takes years typically. And certainly you've got to do a lot of homework by talking to the regulators and the local stakeholders who also may use those waters. Talk to others who have already experienced going through the process, other farmers. Starting small helps. There's always this worry that a larger space is going to somehow be more detrimental than a smaller space, even when you're doing regenerative farming. And we've seen resistance to farms over a certain size, like 100 acres. But that is really, frankly, quite small in the grand scheme of things of what we really need to be doing in terms of farming. But starting small is a good lesson to start with. I'd say that, you know, I helped consult for a group that was looking for about 2,000 acres off the coast of California to grow mussels. And there are some really great documents that have all been part of that 6-year process that ultimately failed due to some local permitting bureaucracies. It had nothing to do with the merit of the project itself. But if you go to the Ventura Shellfish Project, just Google that, you'll see a whole slew of strategic planning and permitting documents that would be useful for small as well as large farmers, particularly along the West Coast where it's still kind of new. With regard to what's holding the industry back, frankly, right now, farmers can grow more kelp than there are markets in some regions of the country. And the market for kelp has some challenges to find that right volume to keep the farmers and customers happy. You know, so I think, as Courtney was saying, we're gonna hit a saturation at some point with food. I don't know when. Hopefully never. But as the industry can grow, it's probably going to meet the needs of new non-food kelp markets, and that will come as prices drop. And I'm not going to get into the details of the selective breeding program I'm doing with kelp, but we've begun to be able to breed kelp strains that are 4 times more productive than the average yield of the current day farms. This is going to be really important for farmers to not have to build a 400-acre farm when they could do what they could harvest in 100 acres, because space is going to be critical. And we need to make sure that these strains are not that different from the wild, or, as we're trying to do, create sterile strains so that they can't interbreed with the wild. We want to maintain genetic diversity of the wild populations and not impact them. But I can get into that offline with folks if they want to learn more.
Awesome. Thanks, Scott. Tamsin, barriers.
Yeah, I'm going to echo Scott and a couple other people that there's this kind of chicken and egg conundrum of processing, and then product development, and also getting large scale investment, is that people want kelp, but you don't know what to do with all the kelp until you have all that kelp, but then you have all that kelp and don't know what to do with it. There's also a lot of biological unknowns with kelp, especially in Alaska, that we've encountered, is that we've seen some restrictions with regulations based on a lack of knowledge of genetics. What does a population of kelp entail? Well, no one's really surveyed closely the genetic relationship between kelp beds a kilometer apart or 100 kilometers apart, so we don't know, and that's been a big regulation hurdle. That has definitely reflected onto farms' abilities to grow certain species or target certain areas. And then we don't know how much of canopy can be harvested sustainably. There's still active wild harvest of kelps within Alaska, and they're doing so far sustainably, but there isn't any information on how much they can harvest within an area. The Alaska Department of Fish and Game has been very conservative in a lot of these endeavors, which I can appreciate as a biologist and as an Alaskan. But those are questions that we need to know before we can start really expanding and driving this industry forward.
Absolutely. Sam, some barriers.
Yeah, I really see the processing and stabilization piece as a pretty major barrier right now, because I feel like right now we have, as Scott was saying, lots of people growing kelp, and then we have people who want kelp, but they, you know, what you're producing when you grow kelp is a mass of wet seaweed, and the people who are buying it want usually dried, flaked, or milled seaweed. And so there's a big disconnect there. And, you know, there are lots of other crops. This is not the only thing that requires this. You know, grains all get harvested within a 3-month period and then need to be dried, cleaned, and stored somewhere for the entire rest of the year. All the flour that you eat the entire year comes from a few months of harvest. Same thing with cranberries, same thing with, you know, but we just don't have the infrastructure in this country yet for seaweed. And so I think if we're going to see it grow on the commercial side, we really need to invest in that processing, and whatever science needs to happen to make regulators comfortable with that, because there is still very limited food safety guidance around kelp and processing of it.
Awesome. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, connecting those dots. Courtney, bring us home with your barriers. You've answered a few in the chat, I see already.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a barrier for sure, is being able to, okay, so as a food company, and I'll be like super honest, we came into it in our first year, I think, which was the 2019 harvest. And, you know, we're basically, we were working with a company called Sea Green Farms, and they were kind of like, well, you need to buy all of the kelp you need for the next year all at once, and then you need to pay for the storage of it. And, you know, we had never started a food company before, so we knew that was like a little irregular, but also we weren't aware of just how difficult that is. I mean, imagine you have zero sales, and you have to project exactly how much you need of your core ingredient for an entire year. And so we ended up outlaying, I think it was like maybe $40,000, which was a ton of money, for all this kelp, and we're like still getting through that kelp like 2 years later. So we, obviously like thought we were going to do a lot better than we did in our first year of sales. So that was really hard and challenging. And then every year since then, it's just become a little easier and easier to, figure out as the supply chain develops. So, as an example, right now we work with a fantastic processing company that Greenwave has been involved in called the Crop Project. And the Crop Project, basically is like you can now buy this on a quarterly basis, and we'll pay for some of the storage costs, and we'll sell it to you not just in big drums of wet frozen kelp, but we'll mill it, or we'll flake it, or we'll powder it, and that's obviously really helpful for us in terms of product development. The closer we can get to kelp being offered as an ingredient to spec, the way we can buy mushrooms in 1,000 different forms, or our pea protein in a bunch of different forms, the easier it will be for more food brands to come into the space. So I think that touches on what Sam just said around the processing piece, having that middleman, because farmers do not want to deal with processing kelp. I mean, most don't. They've just spent all year growing it out on the cold ocean and hauling it in, and brands, unless you're vertically integrated and really well capitalized, don't usually have the funding to set up that processing space. So it really does require the right kind of middleman there. And yeah, Crop Project's great. Atlantic Sea Farms is also selling kelp this year. I'm sure there's others, but those are the two that we've been talking to.
Awesome. Thanks. That is great to hear. And so, yeah, I'm going to try and get to a few of the audience questions, and I'll direct them to specific panelists. And rest assured that we are capturing all of these, and we're going to save the chat and share that with everyone, including panelists, to answer any follow-up questions. So we'll do the best we can in the 5 minutes that we have. And then my colleague Amy and I are going to stay on for 10 minutes after to address any, loose ends. So, okay. So a few questions that were sent in. One is someone who's interested in the carbon sequestration pathways for seaweed. So the question is, would you have any views on pathways such as sink to sequester, converting seaweed to biochar, using seaweed in materials like bioplastics, and which pathway has a better sequestration potential in terms of permanence, verifiability, and scale? And maybe I'll start with directing this to Scott.
Sure, I've studied this a little bit. It's certainly coming up more and more in scientific circles, especially since there was a recent National Academies report that came out a couple months ago. It looked at 6 different methods of sequestering carbon using ocean solutions, and the top 3 were ocean alkalinity, iron fertilization, and seaweed farming as a potential source. Now, the seaweed farming they looked at was very draconian in some circles, where you'd simply take the entire harvest and sink it to the deep abyssal depths, more than 1,000 meters. There's good evidence that once it was dragged to those kind of depths, that it would be sequestered away for hundreds, if not thousands of years. But they didn't look at what would be the benthic impacts of that. It's not like a desert down there. There is marine life. There are important biological processes that happen at that depth. Nobody's really studied that. So that would be scientific question number 1. But to get to the scale, gigaton scale, we're talking about which we need to do more than a gigaton a year to meet our climate objectives. With seaweed farming alone, it's not really practical. It could be part of the solution. But the other piece that Carlos Duarte and others have been looking at, and Oceans 2050 is a group that's spearheading a lot of this scientific corroboration of how much carbon actually is sloughed off of a farm, a kelp farm, for instance, or any seaweed farm, even tropical seaweed farms, and gets washed away to the deep abyssal depths, or buried in the sediment on the seafloor. And the figures are somewhere between maybe 10 to 15% of the harvestable carbon has previously gone into the sediments. That's not insignificant. Those are carbon credits that farmers could be applying for, and we as a global society should perhaps be paying for, because those are important methods of taking carbon out of the atmosphere into seaweed tissues and then into the seafloor. So there are prospects for farmers being compensated and the ecosystem benefiting from seaweed farming, certainly.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Scott. And in our last minute, I'm just going to invite Courtney, or anyone else who has opinions on the concerns over concentration of heavy metals or marine toxins being absorbed into seaweed or shellfish, to respond to that a little bit in the chat. We'll come back to that if we have a little bit more time in our little 10-minute extension. But before we all break off at the end of the hour, I'm just going to share my screen and invite Amy to share some of our calls to action and next steps.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Lainey. I'm Amy. I work at Terra and I'm an enthusiast of regenerative ocean farming, and so grateful for our panelists and our questions and everyone for participating. I did Terra.do is a school and a community for people who really want to take action on climate change. So we have just a couple of calls to action to kick off this session. We will make sure all of these links get included in the follow-up. Please encourage your friends to think about their diets. Please eat more locally sourced shellfish, seaweed, some of the amazing products that Courtney mentioned. I get a Kua burgers. They're fantastic. Please consider donating to Greenwave or Woods Hole. Check out their websites. There's tons of really fantastic research and learning to be done for those who have questions that we didn't get to. We also have a workshop coming up in just 2 weeks at this exact time. So March 1st at 11 a.m., Terra.do alumni started a small seaweed line in Massachusetts. He's going to be doing a how-to workshop on what it took to get that started. So if that's of interest to you, please join. We'll send information afterwards. And then I can't help but give a special shout out to Lainey, who leads Terra.do's Climate Farm School, for moderating this panel. Thanks, Lainey. If you're sitting on this call and saying, I want to become a regenerative farmer, please consider looking at the Climate Farm School. We've got some potential regenerative ocean courses coming in the coming months, and already some land-based options on the books. So I will leave it there and just give one more massive round of thank you to all our panelists. I also know a lot of people who are part of this event and posting in the chat have a lot of expertise and knowledge. So a ton of gratitude for you guys for also sharing your resources. So take care, enjoy your days. Lainey and I are going to stick on, as we said, for a few more minutes. We know our panelists have lots of things to do in the world to make this vision be realized. So we will let them go and bid them adieu. If they want to stay on, we will be enthusiastic, of course, but let's just say thank you so much. Feel free to share a reaction on Zoom. I wish we can give a grand round of applause, but we don't have that capability. So if you want to share a heart reaction or a clap reaction to share the love, I always find that that's really appreciated. Thank you, everyone. Enjoy your evenings, mornings, days.
Yes, thank you, panelists. Great to be with you all this morning. And
Thank you,
participants, for all these amazing questions. We have a real repository of kelp and seaweed information in this chat, Amy.
Absolutely. I am saving this. I'm getting all the resources and we will send them out. If some of the panelists, do you guys all, I noticed the three of our panelists are still here. Do you have another minute to answer one or two more questions? No, great. I was like, Sam, you got to go get on with thank you for sticking on with your bright face. Enjoy your day. Scott, if you need to head off as well, please. Oh, it looks like Scott, you're on mute.